At the most exclusive charity gala of the year, surrounded by the city's elite tech millionaire, Cornelius Godfrey decided to make his wife the punchline of a cruel joke. He pointed to the simple silver locket on her neck and laughed, telling his rivals she had the taste of a schoolgirl, not the wife of a titan. But Cornelius didn't know the truth about that locket, or about the quiet, unassuming woman he'd taken for granted for 10 years. He was about to learn that while he was busy building an empire of glass and steel, his wife Ariane was the custodian of a legacy forged in diamonds and gold, a secret worth more than his company's entire quarterly profit. This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about the catastrophic cost of underestimation. Cornelius Godfrey loved the sound of his own voice, especially when it was reverberating through rooms that cost more to decorate than most people earned in a lifetime. Their penthouse apartment, a sterile masterpiece of glass and chrome overlooking the city, was one such room. It was less a home and more a showroom for his success. And in this showroom, Ariane Godfrey was his most prized and most overlooked exhibit. To the outside world, they were the perfect couple. Cornelius, the brash self-made founder of Godfrey Innovations, a fintech company that had disrupted the industry, and Ariane, his beautiful, serene wife, who chaired charity committees and hosted flawless dinner parties. She was grace personified, a soft counterpoint to his sharp edges. She dressed in elegant, understated clothing from designers like The Row and Loro Piana, expensive, yes, but never flashy. Her taste was impeccable, quiet, and classic. Cornelius, however, was anything but quiet. He wore his success like a suit of armor, bespoke and blindingly expensive. He believed he had created everything in his life from scratch, including his wife. He'd met her when she was a university librarian, a quiet intellectual beauty, and he had in his mind elevated her. He gave her a life of unimaginable luxury, and in return he expected adoration and compliance. For 10 years he had mostly gotten it. "What is that you're wearing tonight?" he asked, striding into their vast walk-in closet. He adjusted his brioni tie, his eyes flicking over her in the mirror. She was in a simple navy blue gown by Schiaparelli, a masterpiece of tailoring that whispered its expense rather than shouted it. Ariane clasped a necklace around her neck. It was a delicate, unadorned silver locket on a simple chain. It was old, clearly not a modern piece, and had a soft, worn patina. Cornelius's lip curled slightly. "That. You're wearing that to the Metropolitan Children's Foundation. Gala Ariana, for God's sake. Brandon Holloway will be there. The board of Axiom Corp will be there. I need you to look the part." "It was my grandmother's," she said softly, her fingers tracing the smooth surface of the locket. It was the only piece of jewelry she wore with any regularity, a stark contrast to the glittering jewels he occasionally bought her, which mostly sat in a velvet-lined vault. "Your grandmother was a lovely woman, I'm sure. But she wasn't married to me," he said dismissively. He walked over to the vault, his thumb pressing against the biometric scanner. The heavy door hissed open, revealing trays of diamonds, emeralds, and sapphires, all neatly arranged under LED lights. "Wear the Bulgari serpent, the one with the emerald eyes. It says power. It says we have arrived." "I prefer this," Ariane said, her voice still calm, but with a firmness he chose to ignore. "It's sentimental. Sentimental doesn't close deals," he scoffed. "It's cheap. It makes you look like a schoolgirl. It makes me look like I don't provide for my wife." He slammed the vault door shut with more force than necessary. The sound echoed in the cavernous closet. "Fine. Wear your trinket. But when Holloway's wife is dripping in Graf diamonds, don't come crying to me when you feel inadequate." Ariane simply looked at his reflection in the mirror, her expression unreadable. Inadequacy was not a feeling she was familiar with, though Cornelius seemed determined to project it onto her. He saw her simple locket as a sign of her simple past, a past he thought he had successfully erased with his wealth. He had no idea that the locket was not a relic of a humble history, but the quiet, unassuming key to a legacy so vast it would make his own empire look like a child's sand castle. He saw a trinket. She knew it was a symbol of a promise. And tonight, he was about to give her every reason to break it. The drive to the gala was tense. Cornelius was on his phone, barking orders at a subordinate, his voice sharp with irritation. He was preparing for a battle with Brandon Holloway, a corporate raider who was rumored to be sniffing around Godfrey Innovations, looking for weakness. Cornelius's entire being was focused on projecting an image of unassailable strength. He believed perception was reality. Ariane sat silently looking out at the city lights. She felt the cool weight of the locket against her skin. Inside it wasn't a picture, but a tiny folded piece of paper, a quote from her grandfather written in his spidery hand: "The loudest man in the room is the weakest." Cornelius had never been quieter, and Ariane in her silence had never been stronger. She was tired of being an exhibit. Tonight, she would become the curator. The grand ballroom of the Regent Hotel was a symphony of excess. Crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small car, cast a diamond-like glitter over the assembled guests. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, and the low hum of powerful people making powerful conversation. This was Cornelius Godfrey's natural habitat. He moved through the crowd like a shark, all teeth and forward momentum, with Ariane trailing in his wake like a silken remora. He schmoozed, he laughed too loudly, he clapped men on the back with performative camaraderie. Ariane played her part to perfection. She smiled, she nodded. She remembered the names of children and inquired about recent trips to Gstaad. She was the epitome of the supportive, decorative wife. They eventually found their table, a prime piece of real estate near the stage, shared with a banking CEO. And to Cornelius's simultaneous fury and delight, Brandon Holloway and his wife Tabitha. Brandon was everything Cornelius aspired to be, and secretly loathed. He came from old money with a casual, predatory grace that Cornelius's newer, louder wealth could never replicate. Tabitha Holloway was a vision draped in a glittering Oscar de la Renta gown and adorned with a staggering diamond necklace that looked like a frozen waterfall. "Cornelius, good to see you," Brandon said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "And Ariane, you look lovely as always. Such a classic, simple look." The word simple was a dagger, and Cornelius felt it twist. He glanced at Tabitha's necklace, then at the plain silver locket on his wife's chest. The comparison was stark, and in his mind humiliating. The dinner conversation was a verbal jousting match between the two men. They talked market caps, acquisitions, and the new SEC regulations, each sentence a carefully crafted display of dominance. Ariane engaged politely with Tabitha, discussing the charity and the upcoming auction, her voice a calm murmur beneath the men's verbal sparring. The auction was the centerpiece of the evening. A weekend on a private yacht, a Warhol print, a bespoke suit from a Savile Row tailor. Cornelius determined to outdo Holloway, bid aggressively on everything. He won a vintage Aston Martin for a price that made the room gasp, casting a triumphant look at Brandon, who simply took a slow sip of his wine, unimpressed. It was after the auction, when the alcohol had been flowing freely, and Cornelius's ego was both inflated by his win and bruised by Holloway's nonchalance that he made his fatal error. A photographer from a society magazine was making the rounds. Mr. Godfrey. Mr. Holloway, a picture for our gala feature. The men stood pulling their wives to their sides. As the camera flashed, Brandon Holloway, ever the subtle provocateur, gestured towards Ariane. "I must say, Ariane," he drawled, his voice carrying just enough for the surrounding tables to hear, in a room full of such ostentatious displays, your choice of jewelry is refreshingly modest. A family piece, I presume. Cornelius saw his opening. He thought it was a chance to one-up Holloway, to turn his wife's perceived flaw into a display of his own magnanimity and humor. He was wrong. He wrapped an arm around Ariane's shoulders, a gesture that looked possessive rather than affectionate. He laughed, a booming sound that drew even more attention. "Modest is one word for it," Cornelius announcannounced to the small crowd that had now formed. "I keep telling her, darling, let me buy you the world. I'd drape you in Van Cleef and Arpels from head to toe. But she's attached to her little, what is that? Honey, a trinket from a school crush." A few people tittered nervously. Ariane's smile didn't falter, but her eyes went cold. He wasn't done. He was playing to the audience now, his voice dripping with condescending affection. "You see, Brandon, this is what happens when you marry for love and not for pedigree. You get sentimentality. She has a vault full of real jewels at home, of course, masterpieces. But she prefers this little silver thing. It probably cost all of $20, 50 years ago. But what can I do? It reminds her of where she came from. And it reminds me," he said, leaning in as if sharing a grand secret of how much I've given her. He finished with a self-satisfied smirk, expecting applause, or at least appreciative chuckles. Instead, a profound and heavy silence fell over the table. Even Brandon Holloway looked slightly taken aback by the sheer cruelty of the display. Tabitha's perfectly made-up face was a mask of shock. They hadn't witnessed a joke. They had witnessed a public execution of a wife's dignity. But it was Ariane's reaction that was most unsettling. She didn't flush with embarrassment or shrink away. She simply stood there, a faint, almost imperceptible smile on her lips. She gently removed Cornelius's arm from her shoulder. Her gaze met his, and for the first time in a long while, he saw something other than placid acceptance in her eyes. He saw steel. She turned to Brandon and Tabitha. "Cornelius is right," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the silence. "It is a sentimental piece. It reminds me of my family's most important lesson. True value is often hidden in plain sight, and only a fool mistakes quietness for weakness." She then turned not to Cornelius, but to the wider audience. "Thank you all for a lovely evening, supporting such a wonderful cause." Without another glance at her husband, she walked away from the table, her back straight, her head held high. She didn't storm out of the gala. She simply moved towards the powder room, with the unhurried grace of a queen leaving a tedious court affair. The silence she left behind was more damning than any shouting match could ever have been. Cornelius Godfrey stood alone, the flash of the camera capturing the dumbfounded, arrogant confusion on his face. The crack in the perfect facade of his life had appeared, and it was about to shatter everything. The car ride back to the penthouse was a study in suffocating silence. Cornelius drove his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He kept glancing at Ariane, expecting tears, a screaming match, some sort of emotional outburst he could manage, dismiss and then fix with an expensive gift. That was the familiar script of their disagreements. But Ariane offered him nothing. She sat perfectly still, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze fixed on the blur of city lights. She wasn't crying. She wasn't angry. She was absent. It was as if the woman who had sat beside him for 10 years had been replaced by a stranger, a calm, collected observer who was merely sharing a ride with him. This unnerved him more than any fight could. "Are you going to say anything?" he finally snapped as they pulled into the private garage beneath their building. Ariane turned to look at him, her expression as placid as a frozen lake. "I believe everything that needed to be said was said at the gala. You were very clear." "Oh, don't be so dramatic," he scoffed, the guilt he felt momentarily transmuting into aggression. It was a joke, a little ribbing between rivals. "You're being overly sensitive." "Was I?" She asked, her voice soft but sharp like a shard of ice. She didn't wait for an answer. She opened her car door and stepped out, walking towards the private elevator without a backward glance. Upstairs in the penthouse, the silence stretched thin and brittle. Cornelius poured himself a large scotch, the clink of the decanter against the glass, sounding unnaturally loud. He watched her as she moved through the living room, a space they shared, but in which they suddenly seemed like trespassers in each other's lives. "Look, I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling foreign and clumsy in his mouth. It was a stupid thing to say. "Holloway was getting under my skin. I'll buy you a new necklace tomorrow. Anything you want. We'll go to Cartier." Ariane paused at the entrance to their bedroom wing. "You still don't understand, do you?" she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "This was never about the jewelry. It was about respect. And you made it abundantly clear that you have none for me. Good night, Cornelius." She disappeared down the hallway, and he heard the soft click of the master bedroom door closing. He was left alone in the vast, empty living room, the city lights twinkling below like 1,000 mocking eyes. He had been locked out not just of a room, but of a life he thought he completely controlled. The next morning, Ariane was gone before he woke up. This was not unusual. She often attended early morning yoga classes or charity breakfasts. A note was left on her pillow, written in her elegant, looping script. "Cornelius, I have some personal matters to attend to. I will be staying with Penelope for a few days. I think some space would be beneficial for both of us. Ariane." Penelope Grant was Ariane's closest friend, the owner of a successful contemporary art gallery downtown. Cornelius despised her. He found her to be a sharp-tongued, independent woman who filled Ariane's head with unnecessary ideas. He crumpled the note in his fist. This was her move, was it? A little passive-aggressive retreat to her friend's house to make him sweat. Fine. He'd let her have her little tantrum. He had a company to run. But as the day wore on, an unfamiliar sense of unease began to creep in. He called her phone, and it went straight to voicemail. He sent a text. It remained unread. He tried to log into their joint bank account to see if she'd been on a retail therapy spree he could use as leverage. Access denied. His password was no longer valid. He felt a prickle of alarm. That was a high net worth account, their primary household account. He was the primary signatory. How could she have locked him out? He called his private banker, a man who usually answered on the first ring. It went to voicemail. Meanwhile, across town, in a sun-drenched Soho loft, filled with abstract art. Ariane was not having a tantrum. She was in command. With Penelope quietly making coffee in the background, Ariane sat at a large oak desk, a laptop open in front of her, and a burner phone at her side. Her face, which so often held a mask of serene neutrality for Cornelius, was alive with focus and determination. Her first call was to a man named Mr. Beaumont at the international auction house, Hemlocks. "Gideon, it's Ariane," she said, her tone warm but all business. "The timeline has moved up. I need the full appraisal team ready. Not just for insurance, for liquidation valuation. Yes, everything. We'll start tomorrow morning at 10. I'll have the security team meet you at the townhouse." The townhouse. Not the penthouse she shared with Cornelius, but a discreet, unlisted property in the West Village she had owned long before she'd met him. A property he didn't even know existed. Her second call was to her lawyer, a woman named Helen Pierce, known in legal circles as the Shark in Chanel. "Helen, it's time. Execute the Godfrey Protocol. Yes, all of it. He's shown his hand. The accounts are firewalled." Ariane listened intently. "Excellent. And the SEC package?" "Send it. Anonymous delivery, of course. The courier is on standby." Her final call was to the security chief of her family's private holding company, a man who had worked for her father for 30 years. "Robert, I need a team at the penthouse. I'll be retrieving personal property. Mr. Godfrey will likely be present. I need you to ensure the process is smooth. Non-confrontational, but absolute. My authority, yes." She closed the phone, took a deep breath, and accepted a mug of coffee from Penelope. "Are you sure about this, Kat?" Penelope asked softly, her eyes full of concern. Ariane looked out the window, her gaze steely. "He left me no choice, Penny. For years I let him believe I was simple, because it was easier. I let him think my world was small because I didn't want to threaten his fragile ego. But last night he didn't just mock me. He mocked my grandmother. He mocked my entire family's legacy. He did it to feel powerful in front of another man. The storm has been cool, been gathering for a long time. He just provided the lightning." 2 days after the gala, Cornelius Godfrey arrived at the penthouse in a foul mood. His company's stock had taken a mysterious dip. His banker was still unreachable, and Ariane was still silent. He was ready to end this ridiculous charade. He would go to Penelope's gallery, drag Ariane home if he had to, and lay down the law. As he stepped out of the elevator, however, he found his law no longer applied. 2 large, impassive men in dark suits stood in his foyer. A third, an older man, with a military bearing, stood in front of them. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Cornelius asked, his voice laced with authority. "Who are you?" "Mr. Godfrey." The older man said, his tone respectful but firm. His name was Robert. "We are private security. We are here at the request of Mrs. Godfrey to oversee the removal of her personal property." Cornelius blinked. Her personal property, her clothes. "This is insane. Get out of my home." "This is also Mrs. Godfrey's home," Sir Robert replied calmly. "We are here only to ensure a peaceful process." "Mrs. Godfrey is in the library." Furious Cornelius stormed past them. He expected to find Ariane tearfully packing books or photo albums. Instead, he found a scene of methodical, quiet industry. Ariane was there dressed not in a cashmere lounge set, but in a tailored business suit. With her was an elderly, impeccably dressed man, with a jeweler's loop hanging from a ribbon around his neck. 2 other people in white gloves were carefully packing velvet trays into reinforced aluminum cases, and laid out across the vast mahogany library table, glittering under the focused beam of a task lamp, was a collection of jewelry, so magnificent it made the contents of his own vault look like costume trinkets. There were pieces he had never seen before, a breathtaking Art Deco necklace of sapphires and diamonds, a set of Colombian emeralds, so large they looked unreal, a tiara that seemed to have been spun from moonlight, and pearls. "Ariane, what in the hell is going on?" Cornelius demanded. Ariane didn't look up immediately. She was pointing to a ruby brooch shaped like a phoenix. Note the Burmese origin. Gideon, and the provenance paperwork from the Patiala Royal Collection should be in folder 7. "Of course, my dear," the elderly man, Mr. Beaumont, murmured. Only then did she turn her cool gaze to Cornelius. "I'm moving out, Cornelius, and I'm taking what belongs to me." "Belongs to you," he laughed, a harsh, incredulous sound. "I bought you every piece of jewelry you own. This is marital property. You can't just walk out with millions of dollars of my assets." Ariane raised an eyebrow. "Your assets? Cornelius, you didn't buy any of this. You've never even seen any of this. These pieces belong to the Allerton Trust, my family's trust. I am merely its custodian." Cornelius stared at her, then at the jewelry, then back at her. Allerton. That was her maiden name. He had never given it much thought. He knew her parents had passed away, that she had been raised by her grandparents. He assumed they were comfortable, perhaps moderately wealthy academics. He had never bothered to dig any deeper. Mr. Beaumont cleared his throat. "If I may, sir, this is the Allerton collection. One of the finest privately held collections of signed 20th century jewelry in the world. This Cartier Tutti Frutti bracelet alone," he said, gesturing with a gloved hand, "is valued at approximately $2 million. The cashmere sapphire ring, perhaps 3. The entire collection here. Well, the preliminary insurance appraisal is in the range of $15 million. The number hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen out of the room. 15 million. Cornelius felt his knees go weak. 50 million, he stammered. "That's a conservative estimate pending certification," Ariane said calmly, as if discussing the price of groceries. "And that doesn't include the piece you so admired at the gala." She reached into her handbag and pulled out the silver locket. She handed it not to Cornelius, but to Mr. Beaumont. "And this Gideon." The appraiser took it reverently. He examined it under his loupe, his breath catching. "Ah, yes. I thought so. The markings are unmistakable." He turned to Cornelius. "Sir, this is not a $20 trinket. This is an early unsigned piece by Fulco di Verdura, crafted for a very special client when he was still designing for Paul Flato. The silver is in fact platinum, and the chain is not original. It was a simple locket commissioned by Ariane's grandfather for her grandmother. A sentimental piece, as she said." He carefully opened the locket. Inside was not a folded piece of paper. It was a single, flawless 5-carat blue diamond cut in the shape of a heart, nestled in a bespoke platinum setting. "The Allerton blue," Mr. Beaumont said softly. "Thought to have been lost. Its value is effectively priceless. It has no market equivalent." Cornelius stared at the locket, the object of his public scorn. The trinket, the symbol of his wife's supposed simplicity, was worth more than the Aston Martin he had bought at the auction, possibly more than his penthouse. The entire foundation of his reality shifted, cracking and groaning under the weight of this revelation. His wife was not just a librarian he had rescued from obscurity. She was an heiress of unimaginable wealth who had simply been observing him. Why, he whispered the question, a ragged exhalation. Why hide all this? Ariane finally looked at him. her eyes filled not with triumph, but with a profound, weary sadness. I didn't hide it, Cornelius. I just lived it quietly, the way my family always has. I wanted a partner who loved me for who I was, not for the Allerton Trust. For 10 years I thought I had that. I let you believe your narrative because I hoped one day you would see me. But last night you made it clear. You don't see me at all. You see a reflection of yourself, an accessory, and you tried to use what you thought was my simple past to humiliate me. You were wrong. It wasn't a symbol of my past. It was a test of your character. And you failed spectacularly. The verdict was delivered, and with it, Cornelius Godfrey's world, the one he thought he had built, began to dissolve into dust. Cornelius's mind reeled. $15 million, a priceless blue diamond. It was a staggering sum, a life-altering revelation. But after the initial shock, his predatory instincts kicked in. His brain, wired for acquisition and leverage, began to churn. He saw not the end of his marriage, but a new, unforeseen opportunity. "Okay," he said, forcing a conciliatory smile. "Okay, Ariane. I am stunned. And I am an idiot, I admit it, a complete arrogant fool. I was wrong about the locket, I was wrong about everything. But this changes things. For the better." Ariane and Mr. Beaumont exchanged a look. The professional packers continued their work, their movements silent and efficient, like orderlies in a morgue. "This doesn't have to be the end." Cornelius continued, his voice gaining momentum, the familiar cadence of a sales pitch returning. "This is a new beginning. We're a power couple, Kat. We always have been, but now it's real. Your legacy, my innovation. The Allerton Trust and Godfrey innovations. We can merge our strengths. We can build a dynasty." He saw it all in a flash, her family's old money, respectability, legitimizing his new money empire, the social doors her name could open, the capital he could access. The humiliation at the gala was a distant memory, a small price to pay for this new golden future. Ariane watched him, her expression a mixture of pity and resolve. She let him finish his frantic, desperate monologue. When he was done, panting slightly with the effort of his vision, she delivered the final blow. "There is no dynasty, Cornelius," she said, her voice cutting through his fantasy. "And there is no Godfrey innovations. Not for much longer, anyway." A cold dread, colder than any he had felt before, began to seep into his bones. "What are you talking about?" "My company is stronger than ever. We just posted record earnings." "Did you?" she asked. She walked over to the library's built-in desk and picked up a slim leather-bound folio. She opened it and pushed it across the polished wood towards him. "I've had a lot of quiet evenings over the past few years, Cornelius. While you were out at client dinners or working late, I was here. You thought I was reading novels or planning parties. Sometimes I was. But I was also learning. My grandfather didn't just leave me a collection of jewels. He left me a controlling interest in a global holding company. And he taught me how to read a balance sheet." Cornelius looked down at the folio. It was a meticulously detailed forensic accounting report of his own company. It showed inflated revenue projections, falsified asset declarations, and a complex web of offshore shell corporations in the Cayman Islands and Panama. It detailed how he had been systematically defrauding his investors and the board for the last 3 years to cover a series of catastrophic trading losses. It was all there, in black and white, irrefutable. "How?" he whispered, his face ashen. You're careless with your passwords, Cornelius. You use the same one for everything Innovate King one. It wasn't hard to gain access. And once I saw the first discrepancy, the rest of the threads were easy to pull. She explained, her voice devoid of malice, sounding more like a CEO delivering a disappointing quarterly report. You built an empire of cards, and the wind is starting to blow. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with horror and a dawning, terrible understanding. You wouldn't? I already have, she said simply. A full detailed copy of this report, along with transaction records and supporting documents, was delivered by courier to the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission this morning. Anonymously, of course. I imagine their investigation will be swift and thorough. The truth hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't just about her leaving him. This wasn't a marital spat escalated by money. This was a demolition. She hadn't just protected her assets. She had methodically, brilliantly, and quietly orchestrated his complete and utter ruin. The public humiliation at the gala wasn't the cause of this. It was merely the final piece of evidence she needed to convince herself to proceed. It was the catalyst that turned a contingency plan into an active operation. You planned this, he choked out. I planned for a possibility, she corrected him gently. I hoped I would never have to execute it. I gave you every chance to be the man I thought I married. But that man was an illusion. The real you is the one who would belittle his wife in public to score points with a rival. The real you is a fraud. And I will not be tethered to a fraud. The security men began to carry the first of the aluminum cases out of the library. Mr. Beaumont bowed his head slightly to Ariane. We are ready to depart, Mrs. Godfrey. Thank you, Gideon. Please ensure everything is transported directly to the Geneva vault. She turned to leave. Cornelius, galvanized by pure desperation, lunged forward and grabbed her arm. Ariane, please don't do that. Dora, det är så. We can fix it. I can fix it. Everything I have is tied up in the company. I'll be ruined. I'll have nothing. She looked down at his hand on her arm, then back up at his face, her eyes clear and unwavering. You already have nothing, Cornelius, she said, pulling her arm free. You just didn't realize it until now. And with that, she walked out of the library, leaving him alone with the evidence of his crimes and the echoing silence of his shattered empire. For a long time after Ariane walked out, Cornelius Godfrey did not move. He remained standing in the library, a statue of disbelief amidst the faint scent of old paper and expensive leather. The silence she left behind was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, filled with the echoes of her final damning words. You already have nothing, Cornelius. You just didn't realize it until now. His first instinct was to reject it, to laugh it off as the hysterical threat of a scorned woman. Cornelius Godfrey ruined. By a quiet librarian with a penchant for sentimental trinkets. The idea was preposterous. This was a tactic, a negotiation. He snatched his phone from his pocket, his fingers jabbing at the screen with frantic energy. He would call his CFO, Mark. He would call his legal team. He would crush this little rebellion before it even began. Mark's phone went straight to voicemail. Strange. Mark always answered. He tried his head of legal, then two of the board members he considered his closest allies. Voicemail. Voicemail. A busy signal. A cold knot of dread began to tighten in his stomach. He strode out of the library and into the vast living room flicking on the large television screen embedded in the wall, defaulting to the 24-hour financial news channel out of sheer habit. And that's when his world tilted on its axis. The screen was filled with live footage of the glass and steel monolith that housed his corporate headquarters. His company logo, a sleek, stylized D, was partially obscured by the flashing red and blue lights of federal vehicles. Below it, the chyron screamed in bold white letters, "Breaking news! Davenport Innovations raided in massive fraud probe." Cornelius felt the air leave his lungs. He saw his own face, a smug corporate headshot, in a box next to the live feed. Reporters were shouting into microphones, their words a chaotic jumble of SEC investigation, investor fraud, and offshore accounts. The report Ariane had shown him wasn't a threat. It was a ghost story come to life. The courier had already arrived. The storm had already broken. The sound that escaped his throat was a raw, strangled gasp. He reached for the remote to change the channel, but his hand was shaking so violently he knocked over a heavy crystal decanter of scotch. It hit the marble floor with a sickening crack, the amber liquid pooling like blood around the shards of glass. He didn't notice. He was already surfing through channels, his heart hammering against his ribs. Every major news network was carrying the story. It was real. It was happening. His phone, which had been stubbornly silent when he was making calls, now began to explode with life. The first call was from David Chen, the lead director on his board. Cornelius David's voice was icy, stripped of all its usual warmth. "David, what the hell is going on? This is a mistake, a misunderstanding. Save it." David cut him off coldly. "We just held an emergency teleconference. The board has voted unanimously. Your employment with Godfrey Innovations is terminated effective immediately. We are issuing a press release distancing the company from your abhorrent betrayal of trust. Don't contact us again. Our lawyers will be in touch with yours." The line went dead. Before he could even process the betrayal, another call came in. It was his private banker from Merrill Lynch. Mr. Godfrey, the banker, said, his voice a stiff, formal monotone that bore no resemblance to the deferential tone he usually used. "This call is to officially inform you that pursuant to a federal warrant, all your personal and corporate assets held with this institution have been frozen. A complete freeze. No transfers, no withdrawals, nothing. Frozen." Cornelius choked out. "You can't. I'm sorry, Mr. Godfrey. My hands are tied. I have to act on the instructions I've been given. Goodbye." Click. The walls of the penthouse, once a symbol of his ascent, now felt like they were closing in a gilded prison. He stumbled over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked down at the city below, a city that had once felt like his kingdom. Now it just felt like a long way to fall. His phone buzzed again. He ignored it. He spent the next 2 days in a self-imposed isolation, a ghost haunting the monument to his own hubris. The television provided a constant, torturous narration of his downfall. The stock, after a brief, frantic halt, had been delisted. Wiped out. Pundits and analysts who had once sung his praises now picked over the bones of his company, dissecting his fraud with grim satisfaction. The final public humiliation came on the 3rd day. He was watching the news, numb and unshaven, when a familiar face appeared on the screen. It was Brandon Holloway, standing on the steps of Cornelius's former headquarters, looking poised and powerful. He was announcing that his firm had just acquired the core assets and intellectual property of the now bankrupt Godfrey Innovations, for, as the reporter noted, pennies on the dollar. "We believe in the underlying technology," Holloway said, into the thicket of microphones, his expression a perfect mask of magnanimous concern. "And we are pleased to have the opportunity to salvage what remains of the company, and most importantly, restore a sense of integrity to its operations." It was the ultimate checkmate delivered with a smug, predatory grace. Cornelius wanted to hurl something at the screen, but he lacked the energy. He just sank into a $10,000 sofa and felt the last of his fight drain out of him. His lawyers finally came to the penthouse, their faces grim. They spread their files out on the same mahogany table where Ariane had displayed her jewels. They confirmed what he already knew in his gut. The case against him was airtight. The evidence compiled so meticulously by his wife was a prosecutor's dream. "It's a slam dunk, Cornelius," his lead counsel said, not bothering to soften the blow. "They have everything. Transaction records, server logs, encrypted emails you thought were deleted. This report, it's a confession without your signature. A plea deal is your only option. We can try to get it down to 7 years, maybe less, but you are going to prison." Prison. The word hung in the sterile air of the room. After they left, Cornelius wandered through the silent apartment. He passed the gym. He never used the screening room where he entertained investors, the vast closets filled with suits he would never wear again. He ended up back in the library, the scene of his undoing, and there, placed precisely in the center of the vast empty table, was a single piece of paper he hadn't noticed before. It must have been left by Ariane's team. He picked it up. It was a copy of a donation certificate. Ariane, through a newly established charitable entity called the Allerton Foundation, had made a $5 million donation to the Metropolitan Children's Foundation. The date on the certificate was the day after the gala. He stared at it, the paper trembling in his hand. The sheer exquisite cruelty of it stole his breath. He had publicly mocked her for a $20 trinket for having nothing of her own. In response, she hadn't just destroyed his fraudulent empire. She had taken a fraction of her true wealth and effortlessly done more good than he had ever conceived of, funding the very charity he had used as a stage for his arrogance. He collapsed into a chair, the certificate fluttering to the floor. It wasn't revenge. Revenge was too simple, too emotional a word for what she had done. This was a complete and total erasure. She had shown him that his entire life's work was a fragile lie, while her quiet, hidden world was built on a foundation of unshakable truth and real power. He was Cornelius Godfrey, the innovator, the king. But his dominion was dust, and it was the woman he had dismissed as simple who held the broom that had swept it all away. 6 months had passed. The crisp, biting air of a New York autumn had been replaced by the gentle, lavender-scented breeze of a late summer evening in Switzerland. The sun, a brilliant orb of liquid gold, was beginning its slow descent behind the jagged peaks of the Dents du Midi, casting long, peaceful shadows across the tranquil waters of Lake Geneva. It was a scene of such profound serenity that it felt like a painting a world away from the chrome and glass cage she had once called home. Ariane Allerton stood on the wide stone terrace of her villa, a home she had purchased not as a statement, but as a sanctuary. The villa was elegant but understated, built of warm stone and rich wood that blended seamlessly into the hillside. It was a place for living, not for performing. She held a phone to her ear, a soft cashmere shawl draped over her shoulders, her gaze fixed on the shimmering lake below. "I understand, Helen. Thank you for letting me know personally," she said, her voice calm and measured. On the other end of the line, Her lawyer, Helen Pierce, had just finished relaying the final details from the sentencing hearing. He didn't make a statement. Helen added her own voice, professionally detached, but with an undercurrent of finality. He just stood there when the judge read it out. 7 years. With good behavior, he might be out in 5. Ariane closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing the information. It wasn't a moment of triumph. There was no surge of vengeful satisfaction. It was something much quieter, like the soft click of a heavy door finally locking into place. It feels just. She said the words coming out as a soft breath. Not triumphant, just the logical conclusion to a series of poor choices. An understatement, Helen replied dryly. How are things with the foundation? I saw the press release about the Clean Water Initiative in East Africa. A genuine smile touched Ariane's lips, the first since the call began. It's more than a press release now. The first engineering team is on the ground. We're fully funded and launching next month. Penelope is flying in tomorrow to help me finalize the art endowment for the new children's medical wing. It's all moving forward. It feels real. That's wonderful, Ariane. You're building something that will last. That was always the plan, Ariane said softly. After ending the call, she didn't move. She simply stood there, letting the silence of the evening settle around her. For 10 years, her life had been a cacophony of noise. Cornelius's booming voice, the relentless pressure of social engagements, the silent scream of her own stifled identity. Here, the only sounds were the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore and the distant chime of a village church bell. She thought of Cornelius not the broken man in a courtroom, but the titan of industry he had so desperately projected. He had been obsessed with building a legacy, a name that would echo for generations. Yet his legacy was now a crater of fraud and disgrace. And hers, the one he had never even bothered to notice, was quietly, methodically building wells and healing children on the other side of the world. The irony was as vast and deep as the lake before her. The sliding glass door opened behind her, and Penelope Grant stepped out onto the terrace, carrying 2 long-stemmed glasses of a pale, crisp wine. Her presence was as comfortable and welcome as the evening itself. "I thought you might need this," Penelope said, her perceptive eyes taking in Ariane's contemplative mood. She handed her a glass, their fingers brushing. "Perfect timing." Ariane replied, her smile returning. Helen called. Ariane nodded. 7 years. Penelope let out a slow breath. Well, the world is safe from his innovations for a while then. She raised her glass. To new beginnings, and to closing old, very heavy doors. To new beginnings, Ariane echoed the crystal of their glasses, making a clear, pure sound that seemed to hang in the air. They took a sip, the wine cool and refreshing. They stood in comfortable silence for a long moment, watching the last sliver of sun dip behind the mountains, leaving the sky painted in deepening shades of violet and rose. "Do you ever think about him?" Penelope asked, her voice gentle the question, less an intrusion and more an invitation. "About the life you had?" Ariane turned from the view to look at her friend. "I think about the man I thought he was," she said, her voice thoughtful and clear, stripped of all bitterness. "The brilliant, ambitious, charming man I fell in love with a decade ago. The one who seemed so full of life and promise. I find myself mourning that man. The one who got lost somewhere along the way, buried alive under a mountain of his own ego and greed. I feel a sense of loss for that potential for the partnership we could have had." She paused, swirling the wine in her glass. watching the fading light dance within it. But the man who stood in that ballroom, the one who tried to break me, just to make himself feel tall in front of a rival, the fraud who built an empire on lies. No, she concluded, her gaze steady and unwavering. I don't think about him at all. He ceased to exist for me in that moment. As she spoke, her fingers instinctively went to the locket that rested in the hollow of her throat. She had retrieved it from the Geneva vault just last week. Wearing it now felt different. It was no longer a secret test or a hidden weapon. It was simply a part of her. She remembered her grandmother, a woman of quiet but immense fortitude, placing it in her hand on her 18th birthday. Value isn't loud, my dear, her grandmother had whispered, her eyes twinkling. It doesn't need to announce itself. True worth has a quiet confidence. It knows what it is, even when no one else is looking. Let this remind you of that. For so long she had kept that confidence hidden, letting Cornelius's loud, hollow world drown it out. No more. The locket wasn't a symbol of a past she had to hide or a power she had to conceal. It was a link in a chain connecting her to the wisdom of the women who came before her and to the future she was now forging on her own terms. The world had known her as Mrs. Cornelius Godfrey, the quiet, simple wife, a beautiful, well-kept accessory. But that person had been a role she played, a costume she wore for a man who could only love a reflection of himself. Now, standing on this terrace, she was just Ariane Allerton. And Ariane Allerton was not simple. She was not a trinket. She was the vault, the legacy, and the future all at once. A final warm breeze drifted up from the lake, and for the first time in a decade, she felt no weight upon her shoulders, no part to play, no expectation to manage. As the first stars began to prick the deep velvet of the twilight sky, she felt completely unburdened and gloriously, incandescently free. That's the incredible story of Ariane Allerton, a woman who reminded the world that a quiet demeanor should never be mistaken for an absence of power. Cornelius Godfrey saw his wife as a mirror to reflect his own success, but he failed to see the immense depth and strength behind the glass. This story is a powerful lesson in respect, dignity, and the catastrophic consequences of arrogance. It makes you wonder how many seemingly ordinary people around us are holding extraordinary secrets, waiting for the right moment to reveal their true worth. What did you think of Ariane's long game? Was her response justified, or was it a cold, calculated act of revenge? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were moved by this story of hidden strength and ultimate vindication, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who would appreciate it, and make sure you subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that will shock and inspire you. Click that notification bell so you never miss an update. Thanks for listening.